Disclaimer: the different images, clips, and some information seen in this video are not mine. They are owned by their rightful owners, which will be cited at the end of this video.
So hi people, I am Baldizar of Psychology 183 of National University, and today we're going to tackle about the nervous system and its influences to movements. The nervous system is an organ system containing a network of specialized cells known as the neuron and the glia. The nervous system is composed of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system contains the brain and the spinal cord, while the peripheral nervous system contains thousands of nerves that lie outside the spinal cord and the brain. Under the peripheral nervous system is the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is the one responsible for our voluntary movements, while the autonomic nervous system is the one responsible for our involuntary movements. Under the autonomic nervous system is the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is a network of nerves that prepares the organ for vigorous activity, while the parasympathetic nervous system facilitates the non-emergency responses of the body. We're going to talk about the brain. The brain has different parts, mainly the forebrain or the prosencephalon, the midbrain or the mesencephalon, and the hindbrain, which is known as the rhombencephalon. The forebrain contains the cerebral cortex, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the basal ganglia, and the hippocampus. The midbrain or the mesencephalon contains the tectum, the tegmentum, the superior canniculus, the inferior canniculus, and the substantia nigra. The last is the hindbrain, or known as the rhombencephalon, contains the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. The brain is also divided laterally, namely the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere controls the left part of the body and is responsible for visual, spatial perception, and overall picture, while the left hemisphere is responsible for the control of the right side of the body and is responsible for symbolic thinking, language, detail, and literal picture. The brain also has lobes, and it is divided into 4 lobes, namely the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. The first lobe is the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is responsible for the control of fine movements, such as moving one finger at a time. It also contains the primary motor cortex, the premotor cortex, the posterior parietal cortex, and supplementary motor area, which are essential for movements. The next lobe is the parietal lobe. It is the main target for touch sensations and information from muscle stretch receptors and joint receptors. It is also responsible for spatial orientation, perception and comprehension of language, function, and recognizing object by touch. The next lobe is the occipital lobe, which is responsible for the visual processing and receives the raw visual information. It is also responsible for recognition. And the last lobe is the temporal lobe. It is involved in receiving and processing auditory information, higher order visual information, complex aspects of memory, and language. We are also going to talk about the neurons. But what are neurons? Neurons are the basic unit of the nervous system. These cells are responsible for transmitting messages to and from the brain. The neurons has 3 parts, mainly the cell body, the dendrites, and the axon. The cell body is responsible for processing information, coming from other neurons. It is also known as the headquarters of the neuron. The dendrite is responsible for receiving the signals from other neurons and sensory cells, while lastly, the axon is the one responsible for transmitting signals to other neurons. They also carry the messages coming from the dendrites to the cell body and then sending it to another neuron. We are also going to talk about the spinal cord. The spinal cord is part of the central nervous system within the spinal column. The spinal cord communicates with all the sense organs and muscles except those of the head. The spinal cord is a segmented structure, and each segment has on each side a sensory nerve and a motor nerve. The spinal cord is comprised of white and gray matter. The gray matter in the center of the spinal cord is densely packed with cell bodies and dendrites, while the white matter consists mostly of myelinated axon. Each segment of the spinal cord sends sensory information to the brain and receives motor commands from the brain. All that information passes through tracts of axon in the spinal cord. With all this knowledge of the nervous system, the only question left now is, how does the nervous system influence movements?
The different parts of the brain and spinal cord have different functions. So, to know how the nervous system influences movements, we should start with knowing what are these parts that has control over our motor functions. According to brainconnection.com, these are the parts of the brain that is responsible for our movements. The first part would be the function of the primary motor cortex. What is the primary motor cortex? The primary motor cortex is one of the main areas of the brain that is involved in motor function. This primary motor cortex is located in the frontal lobe, which I discussed earlier. Its function is to process the neural impulses that control the execution of the movement. The next is the posterior parietal cortex. It is involved in transforming visual information into motor commands. The next is the premotor cortex. It is involved in the sensory guidance of the movement and controls the more proximal muscles and trunk muscles of the body. And the last is the supplementary motor area. It is involved in the planning of complex movements and in coordinating two-handed movements. So for the spinal cord, the one that is responsible for sending the messages to the body parts that it needs to move is the corticospinal tract. The corticospinal tract is the only direct pathway from the cortex to the spine and is composed of over 1 million fibers. This corticospinal tract is the main pathway for control of voluntary movement in humans. As we all know, there are 3 major functions of the nervous system, and those are receiving sensory input, integrative function, and motor output. In the first function, sensory receptors and sensory nerves are the one responsible for receiving information and sensations, and then sending it to the brain. This is where the afferent division will work by sending the sensory input to the spinal cord, which will send the information to the brain. This will then be processed by the brain, specifically the motor cortices, which are the primary motor cortex, the premotor cortex, and the posterior parietal cortex of the frontal lobe. This is where the different neural impulses will be processed by the primary motor cortex and with the help of the secondary motor cortex, which are the premotor and postparietal cortex. A movement will then be generated and a specific skeletal-muscular part will be decided. The decided movement will then be sent as a signal to a neuron which will carry the signal back to the spinal cord, where an action potential will occur. This is where polarization and depolarization will take place due to the entries and exit of the specific ions in the membrane of the neuron. These signals will then be sent to a synapse between the neurons where the electric signal will be transformed into a chemical signal which will release neurotransmitters that will be received by receptors of the motor neuron in the spinal cord. This will result to a new electric signal which will be then sent to the muscle our brain decided to use. A new synapse between the axon terminals and musculofibers is created. The new electric signal translates itself into a mechanical or physical energy which will result to a movement.